Will you please pray with me? God, we ask that it is you that we hear and feel in these words and in this place. Please fill us with awe and wonder at how great and grand your majesty is. Amen. There's a lot that happened in this chapter. There's a lot of really good stuff, so we're just going to go ahead and jump right in. So we're going to begin with some words from God that we read in this chapter. On page 48 of the story, God says, and you can also find this on Exodus 6 through 8, God says, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians, and I will bring you to the land I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord. This is a good place for us to start, even though it's more towards the middle of our story. It's a good place for us to start because this is God stating intent. God states that this entire Exodus event, the deliverance that is promised, is all for the purpose of showing the Israelites that the Lord is their God. We start here because it foreshadows all that God does for us to show us that we are not alone. And the response to God from Moses, from the Israelites, and even from Pharaoh doesn't differ too far from our own responses to God. Our biggest problem in growing with God and growing in our faith and relationship with God is our sinful nature, our priorities, the way that we organize our life. And though we often try by controlling the situation on our own and looking for quick fixes, we can't cure our own nature. So God brings about a different plan to deliver us from this sin that devours us. We try to control it, and it's because we get stuck in a lower story mentality where we feel like we are the lead characters. But as we'll see with God's upper story today, God works differently, and God's plan is an ultimate plan, and it can take from seconds to centuries to be fulfilled. This week, our story picks up with God's nation being in trouble. God promised Abraham that he'd have descendants that would outnumber the number of stars in the sky. And now, over 400 years later, from that promise to Abraham to where we are in the story today, that nation is growing. But a new Pharaoh is ruling Egypt, and this Pharaoh has no knowledge or connection to Joseph, and he fears this large nation that's growing in the midst of the Egyptians, so he enslaves them and orders that all of their newborn male sons be killed. Now, some might wonder, and this was brought up in Sunday school also, some might wonder why God would allow for this. Well, back in Genesis 15, 12 through 14, which we read just a couple of weeks ago, God told Abraham this would happen, and it's written like this. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. God foresaw this lower story, which makes some think that God caused it, but that's not the case. This Hebrew nation, this promised nation, was enslaved out of fear and the sinful nature of the Egyptians. God knows how humans work. God could see that this would happen. One of these enslaved Hebrew women hid her child for as long as she could. And when she couldn't anymore, she placed him in a basket and put him in the reeds of the Nile. And he was discovered by the Pharaoh's daughter. And he was named Moses because he was drawn from water. God's new nation is in trouble. And God decides to use the oppressive regime of the Egyptians to reveal God's self. Out of all the bad that is happening, God decides to use that oppressive regime to reveal God's self. And he picks an unlikely candidate to help him. Moses grows up and eventually tries to solve a problem between an Egyptian and a Hebrew slave, and he kills the Egyptian. And when others start talking about it, out of fear, he flees for his life, and he ends up in the desert, and he ends up marrying a woman and setting up life there. And one day, while he was out with his father-in-law's flock of sheep, he encounters God in the sight of a bush on fire that never burns. He sees this from a distance. He thinks it's interesting, so he goes to check it out and begins talking to God. And in this exchange, the revelation of God's self to the promised nation begins. And that first revelation is God's name is revealed. On the story, page 46, in Exodus 3:13 through 15, it says this. Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" God says to Moses, "I am who I am." This is what you are to say to the Israelites, "I am has sent me to you." God also says to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, 'The Lord of the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation." God chooses Moses to go and share with the world that God is. God exists. God is life. There is no being without being. That's the power of the name, I am. God is. God exists. God always has existed. God exists now, and God always will exist. And when Moses realizes that God is asking him to deliver this message, he freaks out a little bit. And he says, I can't do it. But God pushes him and comforts him and reminds him of God's ability to work through all of us. And on the story, page 47, God says, "Now go. I will help you speak and will teach you what to say." Basically, God is saying, go, I will be with you, I am. And if you trust, you will see that I am with you. Moses goes, and more of God's self is revealed. The second way is God's power is revealed in the plagues. Moses goes to Pharaoh and pleads for the freeing of the Hebrew people. But of course, who would let go of free labor? The Pharaoh says, no. It's easy for us to be angry with the Pharaoh, right? Slavery is wrong. Of course he should let them go. That's terrible. But I want us to think about this in our own time. Institutionalized slavery still exists, even in our own state. The for-profit prison system, where state governments sell prisons to private corporations, is institutionalized slavery. Attorney John Whitehead writes of this system. Let me quote him for a little bit. He says, "Consider this. Despite the fact that violent crime in America has been on the decline, the nation's incarceration rate has tripled since 1980. Approximately 13 million people are introduced to American jails in any given year. Presently, 1 out of every 100 Americans is serving time behind bars. Yet, while providing security, housing, food, medical care, etc. for 6 million Americans is a hardship for cash-strapped states, the profit-hungry corporations such as Corrections Corp of America and GEO Group, the leaders in the partnership corrections industry, it's a $70 billion gold mine. Thus, with an eye toward increasing its bottom line, CCA has floated a proposal to prison officials in 48 states offering to buy and manage public prisons at a substantial cost savings to the states. In exchange, and here's the kicker, the prison would have to contain at least 1,000 beds, and the state would have to agree to maintain a 90% occupancy rate in the privately run prisons for at least 20 years. That's not too different than slavery in ancient Egypt, except that today's slaves make $70 billion plus for their masters. Well, God doesn't take no for an answer when the Pharaoh says no. And I don't think God wants us to allow for this kind of thing today. So Moses hears God's call and prioritizes God's will over his own. And plagues begin against the Egyptians. Now, the first 9 plagues cause hardships, and Pharaoh relents, but then his heart is hardened, and he denies the freedom of the enslaved nation. But then the 10th plague brings something totally different. With the 10th plague, God not only shows a power that's mighty enough to change even the Pharaoh's heart, but also reveals another piece of God's upper story plan. And the third way God is revealed is God's self is revealed through deliverance. In the 10th plague, the shedding of a lamb's blood is necessary. And with the shedding of this blood, more death arises and more life is given. Foreshadowing the ultimate sacrifice to come thousands of years later that we still remember and celebrate to this day with the shedding of Christ's blood and our deaths to sin to enter in to this new life. After this 10th plague, Pharaoh allows for the Hebrew nation's freedom, and so they go. Anywhere from 1 to 3 million of them get up and leave Egypt and head east. You'd think by seeing God's power in the plagues, they would have faith and trust. But instead, they begin their complaining as soon as things seem to go differently than they want. And they come to this sea, this body of water, and they fear that Pharaoh's army will catch them. So they cry out to Moses on the story, page 53, and Exodus 14:11 through 14. They cry out, saying, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." And Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." And the sea is divided. And they go through, but the Egyptians become stuck and are destroyed. So now at this point in their journey, God has been revealed to them through the name I Am, through the power of the plagues, and now through the deliverance of them and the rescue from Pharaoh's men. Now they'll be happy, right? And follow God's plan. But again, they complain. They go to the desert of Shur and become thirsty, and they complain about needing water. So what does God do? God provides water. But they're still not done. And they end up in the best named place, the most aptly named place. They end up in the desert of sin. And there at the bottom of page 55, while they're hungry, they sin so loudly and crying out, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat with pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." God's response? God provides enough food for all of them. But they're not happy. And the very last line of our chapter today reads, "They tested the Lord, saying, 'Is the Lord among us or not?'" God's very name means existence. And after all they have seen and all that has been revealed, they say, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Our sinful natures get in the way of God's story all the time. And they don't just impact our story with God, but others around us too. When we do things that are damaging to ourselves, we grab others and bring them down with us. Just as the Egyptian fears impacted the promised nation, our choices of where we place our energy, our time, our money impact others around us. And when we stop following and trusting God, we fall to our sinful self. In order for us to hear the heftiness of God's words today, I believe we must prepare our hearts and minds. So I'm going to ask you to stand up and we're going to sing a little song in the middle of this. It's a song you all know. You want to start us off? You can sit if you'd like, or stay standing. It doesn't matter to me. We just heard this story of Moses, and we just prayed to God that we would become a sanctuary, a holy place. Recently, I met with a woman, not a church member, who just wanted someone to listen. And she came to me and she told me the horrors of her childhood and how the destructiveness of her parents, specifically her father's abuse, destroyed her life so much so that she has trouble coping with her life today. This lady was broken and defeated by the sinful nature of someone else who, to all who knew the man on the outside, would have never guessed the terror he was causing his own child. One man's sin and decisions deeply affected another's life forever, and he drug her into hell. I recently attended a symposium on heroin addiction in Stark County, and there I heard 3 stories from 3 amazing young women, all seniors in the same local high school, and all who have lost their brothers to heroin overdoses in the last year. And they shared their stories of loss, anger, sorrow, and hope, and they discussed the nature of an illness and addiction, and how they saw their brothers transformed by something out of their control, how their brothers became slaves, but that society would rather not be bothered by that. We heard how there are over 1 million heroin addicts in the United States and only 1,100 treatment centers. That's how little the rest of us care. All of our decisions and sins can deeply affect others, causing a systemic sin that drags so many into hell. In the midst of these stories, it came to my attention that we are again quarreling amongst ourselves here about music. In the midst of reading about God's presence, power, and promise in the story, but humanity continually turning away, I got to see firsthand the actions of the accounts of the devastation our sin causes. And right alongside these atrocities comes our albatross, our sin, our main priority: music. We are more than the wandering, untrusting nation in this text. We are the Pharaoh, and our slave is First Christian Church. For 20 plus years, this church has battled with enslaving the gospel and controlling its production and appeal through music, and it's a plague that is killing us. Look around. Those of you who tell me that they desire to see this room filled, ask how you are limiting the gospel and disobeying God's will. Where is your heart hardened? Ask how you are becoming a sanctuary for God. There are people who are dying at our doorsteps, and that's not an exaggeration. Roughly 500 homeless persons in Stark County, a death rate to heroin overdoses that has nearly tripled from 2012 to 2014. Nearly 30% of the children in our county are underfed. 1 out of 6 women in their life in the United States have been the victim of an attempted or a completed rape. Every day, 4 to 7 children die from abuse and neglect in our country. All of these people are slaves to a system and people that call themselves, quote, the land of the free. Where is that freedom? Where is the deliverance that is promised in that statement? And here we are spending our time, our money, our energy bickering about the number of verses or the hymns that we like, regardless if they fit the theme for the day or the layout of a bulletin, or how easily we can throw money toward replacing a furnace as we try to enslave the power of God's being in this place. Where are our priorities? God says, I am doing all of these things so that you know I am God. But do we? We aren't even wandering yet because we're still stuck playing Pharaoh. Today's story of Moses should burn our ears and crush our hearts as we realize that we don't have control. And when we try to take control, we will be plagued by our sin, and it will slow us down like the chariot wheels in mud as the walls of our lives and faiths come crushing down around us. This is my story. This is your story. But most importantly, this is God's story. And God's plan isn't for us to stay here. God's plan is for us to be delivered, but there's work we must do as well. There is desert that we must travel through. We must die to our sinful self. We must trust. We must believe, and we must follow. So let us humble ourselves now, as we have the chance to cry out to God and dedicate ourselves to following. Take a moment to pray for Christ to transform your heart and guide your steps. Take a moment to pray for ways to be constructive in furthering the gospel. Pray for the ability to place God's will and the well-being of others over yourself. Pray to be delivered from your sinful nature. Pray to not just complain, but to offer solutions that place God first. Just pray and speak with God, because God is with you. God is. Amen.